Teacher poured super glue on a black girl's hair thinking it was just a hairstyle. Didn't know it was heritage. Didn't know her grandfather was Big Shaq. Didn't know the school was built on land he owned. Now the lesson's reversed. And teacher is about to learn what happens when you try to shame royalty in front of her bloodline. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. It was the kind of morning Atlanta reserved for postcards. Sky a mellow blue, the sun gliding over rooftops, like a promise, and the air fresh with just a hint of autumn bite. At Riverside Elementary, the brick walls gleamed clean, banners fluttered gently with affirmations like "Be kind and we all belong," and parents lingered at drop-off with coffee cups and guarded smiles. Everything looked picture perfect, but in the folds of that polished scene, beneath the surface warmth, something colder moved, subtle, unsaid and simmering. Journey Carter stepped out of her mother's navy SUV, with her usual mix of quiet confidence and curiosity. She was 12, sharp-eyed and emotionally older than her age, though no one would guess that just by looking. She wore her school uniform well, a neatly pressed white polo, navy slacks and shoes she kept scuff-free by habit. But it was her hair that drew the morning light. Braided with care and pride, glistening with beads and black gold thread, her grandmother had spent 3 hours the night before weaving a story into those strands. Each parting line precise, each braid a small defiance, and Journey wore it like a crown. She made her way past the front gate, nodding at Mr. Banner, the aging security guard, who always gave her a respectful two-finger salute. She smiled back, her grin a quiet recognition. It was a normal day, or it was pretending to be. Inside the building, the walls were painted with bright murals, and the smell of floor polish clung to the hallways like something permanent. Children bustled about, some dragging oversized backpacks, others whispering about homework, recess, the usual. But Journey noticed it. How a few eyes flicked toward her, and held a moment too long. How a pair of girls paused their giggles when she passed. How Ms. Beatrice Halden, her homeroom teacher, glanced up from her clipboard, and gave her a tight-lipped smile that didn't reach her eyes. Miss Halden had been at Riverside for 17 years. She was the type who loved structure, rules and control, not out of passion for learning, but for order. She favored neat handwriting, quiet voices, and students who never asked why twice. She wasn't overt, no harsh words, no name-calling, just a constant, cool undercurrent, like winter air slipping under a doorframe. Journey had never been called out directly by her, but she'd felt the weight of being watched more closely, of praise arriving slower, of being misunderstood faster. The classroom buzzed as kids filtered in. Journey took her usual seat near the window. Second row, far left. Her desk was spotless, her notebook open, her pencil sharpened to a clean point. She liked to be ready, always. That's what her grandfather taught her. Control what you can, baby girl. The world's messy, but you stay sharp. No one at school knew who her grandfather was. She didn't need them to. To her, he was just Big Shaq, not the towering basketball legend or media icon, but the man who made the best grilled cheese on rainy days, who taught her chess by candlelight during a blackout, who listened more than he spoke. That was the version of him she carried, quiet power. Ms. Halden called class to order, her heels clicking against the floor as she walked to the board. Journey listened closely, took notes like usual. But there was an itch in the air, a tension that didn't belong. When reading time began, the students gathered in a semicircle on the carpet. Miss Halden pulled a book from the shelf, one of those vintage stories with a cover too worn to be loved. As Journey settled onto the floor, she felt her braids shift, the beads clinking softly. That's when Miss Halden paused mid-sentence, lowered the book slightly, and looked directly at her. "Journey," she said, not sharply, but with a pointed kind of sweetness. "Those beads are making quite the noise. Maybe next time, something less distracting." The class stilled. Journey blinked, trying to read the room. No one laughed. No one spoke. She could feel her ears burning. She nodded, swallowing the lump rising in her throat. But her fingers dug into the carpet slightly. The moment passed. Or it seemed to. Miss Halden returned to reading, voice smooth as ever. But for Journey, something had been cracked open. She wasn't new to these small cuts. She'd been called loud for speaking up, aggressive for stating her opinion, emotional for crying when others were comforted. But this was public. This was coded in manners, but meant to humiliate. And no one said a word. When the bell rang for recess, Journey walked slower than usual. She found a quiet bench near the playground, facing away from the laughter. Her fingers touched the beads in her hair lightly. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her mind. Don't ever shrink for anyone, baby. Your hair holds history. But here she was, shrinking. Across the yard, a group of teachers stood under the shade, sipping from mugs and murmuring. Ms. Halden was among them. Her eyes flicked toward Journey briefly, then away. Back in the classroom after recess, the lights felt harsher. Miss Halden's mood had shifted into something brisk. Instructions came rapid fire. Journey kept her head down, but when it came time for a group activity, Miss Halden assigned her to a table by herself, claiming it was to help you focus. Journey said nothing, but her chest felt tight. Minutes later, Miss Halden moved through the room with a box of craft supplies for an art project. She handed out scissors, markers, glue sticks. When she approached Journey's desk, she paused, looked at the braid draped over the edge of her desk. What is this made of? She asked, lightly tugging at the thread. Journey recoiled instinctively. It's just thread, she said quietly. Ms. Halden frowned. It's a distraction. We don't need distractions during creative work. She reached into the box, pulled out a bottle, not a glue stick but a bottle of liquid glue. Without warning, she tilted it forward over Journey's braid. The narration freezes, not because time does, but because in moments like these, time stretches. Journey's mind flashes to the softness of her grandmother's fingers, the weight of each braid's story. She doesn't scream, doesn't cry, just stares as the thick liquid sinks into the fabric of her hair, sticking, stinging, stealing. Gasps rise around the room. One student stares, mouth open. Another fumbles for their phone. Miss Halden blinks, either unaware or pretending to be. Journey stands slowly. Her chair makes a dull scraping sound. She says nothing, but her silence is deafening. She walks out of the classroom, down the hall, past the colorful murals and the affirmations on the walls that suddenly feel like lies. In the front office, she doesn't ask for help. She just sits. The receptionist looks at her hair, then looks away. Outside, the sun still shines. The banners still flutter. Parents are gone. The world hasn't shifted. But inside one girl, something fundamental. And somewhere a phone rings, and a name long forgotten by the staff is about to remind them that power doesn't always come loud. Sometimes it comes wearing braids. The day had been moving in predictable rhythms, lessons flowing from one to the next. Students half engaged, the school's ambient hum filling the corners like background static. Beatrice Halden stood at the front of the room, one hand resting on the worn spine of an outdated textbook, the other clutching a dry erase marker she wielded like a pointer, a scepter of control more than a tool for learning. Her words came with clipped efficiency, her posture more rigid than usual, and her tone just slightly sharper. Something in her had shifted. It wasn't obvious at first, just the way she pursed her lips more often when glancing at Journey, or how her eyes lingered a second too long whenever Journey's beads caught the light. The class was in the middle of reading a story aloud in a circle, one of those old morality tales wrapped in classroom-appropriate language, shallow lessons of empathy on pages that had never reflected kids like Journey. Halden's voice, cool and controlled, moved through the paragraphs, assigning reading parts like commands. When Journey's turn came, her voice was clear, steady, expressive, too expressive for Ms. Halden's taste. A pause followed. Ms. Halden didn't correct her reading. Instead, she leaned slightly forward and said, Journey, please be mindful of how distracting those beads are. Some of your classmates can't concentrate. The sentence landed like a pin dropped in an auditorium. Every other student instinctively looked away, unsure whether to react. Journey's mouth opened slightly, but no words came. She simply nodded, eyes cast down, her voice stilled like a faucet, suddenly turned off. Miss Halden continued the lesson, but her tone had soured, less instructive now, more performative. She spoke not to teach, but to reassert control. Moments later, the reading circle was over. The class was transitioning to a creative activity, poster boards, scissors and glue. The children moved to grouped tables, chatting quietly as they picked out colored paper and markers. Journey signed to sit at the back alone, reached for a purple sheet and began sketching the outline of a scene from the book. She worked quickly, avoiding eye contact. Her braids brushed her shoulders with each motion, and she could almost hear her grandmother's voice again. Each twist holds a memory. Hold your head high. Mrs. Halden moved through the room, handing out supplies, her heels tapping the linoleum in short, staccato bursts. She approached Journey's desk last, holding a cardboard box filled with supplies. Journey didn't look up. She didn't flinch. She just kept working. And that stillness, that calm resolve, seemed to unnerve Miss Halden more than anything. With a calculated motion, she set the box on the desk, just slightly off-center, so it nudged one of Journey's braids. The girl paused, then adjusted it back into place. Miss Halden reached in, pulled out a bottle of glue. Not the gel stick kind, but the thick liquid one with the orange twist cap. She unscrewed the lid, slowly, deliberately, holding it like a bottle of ink in a historical reenactment. Her hand hovered for a second. Then, in a motion so sudden and quiet it almost didn't register at first, she tilted the bottle forward and a stream of glue poured directly onto one of Journey's braids. There was no scream, no immediate reaction. Just a collective pause, a vacuum of breath sucked from the room. Journey froze. Her body went still as the glue dripped down the braid, thick and white, matting the hair and beads. The sensation hit her scalp like betrayal, sticky and cold, but it was the humiliation that struck deeper than anything else. Her classmates sat paralyzed, their eyes wide, unsure if what they saw was real. The narration stops to linger in this stillness, the kind of paralyzing quiet that only comes when a line has been crossed so boldly, no one knows what to do. One boy's hand gripped his glue stick so hard it bent in half. Another girl's eyes filled with tears, though she didn't understand why. A student in the corner quietly lowered their phone under the table, camera already recording. Ms. Halden capped the bottle, eyes cold and casual. "We can't have distractions, Journey," she said, as if what had just happened were a correction, not an assault. Journey stood up slowly, no rush in her movement. Her chair didn't screech. It whispered as it slid back. She looked down at her braid, touched it lightly, then turned her eyes toward the window. She didn't speak. She didn't cry. She simply walked out of the classroom, the sticky strands of glue leaving a small trail of resistance behind her. No one stopped her. The hallway outside buzzed faintly with the sound of another class in session, oblivious to the tremor that had just rocked room 208. Journey walked past the lockers, past the Student of the Month board, past the mural celebrating diversity and learning. Her steps were silent, steady. The front office staff looked up as she entered, startled by her presence without a hall pass. "I need to call my family," she said flatly. The receptionist blinked. "Is there an emergency?" Journey didn't answer. She just pointed at her hair. Something in the receptionist's expression flickered. Maybe guilt, maybe discomfort, but not urgency. She handed Journey the phone anyway. And as the girl dialed a number she had memorized, her fingers shook just once before she pressed the final digit. Back in the classroom, silence had not yet lifted. The children looked at Ms. Halden as though seeing her for the first time. She straightened her cardigan, wiped her hands on a tissue, and returned to the front of the room. "All right," she said, flipping a page in the lesson plan. "Let's move on to vocabulary." But no one followed. That moment lived in the air like fog, clinging, obscuring, staining everything that came after. For some it would be the moment they first understood the weight of silence. For others, it would be a turning point between obedience and resistance. And for Journey it became a scar not on her body, but on her sense of belonging. Later that day, a video would be uploaded anonymously, 32 seconds long, shot from under a desk, capturing the pour, the freeze, the stillness. It would be watched by thousands in just hours. It would be dissected, debated, doubted, but no one could deny what they saw. And far away from the classroom, in a home where legacy and love lived in equal measure, a phone would ring. A familiar voice would answer, and upon hearing what had happened, he would say only "Text me the address." He wouldn't yell. He wouldn't curse. But something in his tone would carry the kind of weight that systems weren't ready for. Because what that teacher didn't know, what no one at Riverside had bothered to ask, was that Journey Carter's grandfather wasn't just Big Shaq. He was the man who owned the very ground she'd dared to disrespect his granddaughter on. And the storm hadn't even begun yet. Journey's shoes thudded lightly against the hallway floor, each step carrying the weight of something unspeakable. Her braid, soaked in glue, clung to her shoulder like a wound. The school walls, once lined with pastel posters boasting inclusion, kindness, and zero tolerance, now felt like painted lies. Her breath was measured, but her body trembled slightly with every movement. She kept her head high, just like her grandfather taught her, but her silence echoed louder than screams. When she pushed through the frosted glass door of the nurse's office, the air inside felt strangely colder. Mrs. Calloway, The school nurse in her late 50s, with bifocals, and a soft voice that rarely rose above a whisper, glanced up from a tray of tongue depressors. For a moment she just blinked, processing the image of the girl standing before her. Hair matted, glue dripping, eyes too still. Then after too long she said, "Oh." Journey didn't speak. She didn't need to. She simply sat in the plastic chair nearest the wall, waiting for a response that felt delayed by generations. Mrs. Calloway approached cautiously, crouched slightly, examining the mess like it was a science experiment. Did another student do this?" she asked, already knowing the answer, but hoping for one that would make her job easier. Journey turned her head slightly. "No," she said, her voice barely above the hum of the overhead lights. The nurse stood back up, uncertain, tapping her fingers against her clipboard, as if the solution might emerge if she waited long enough. I'll see if we have anything to break down the adhesive," she murmured, disappearing behind a tall cabinet. But Journey heard the hesitation in her steps, the way her hands fumbled as she shuffled bottles and gauze. There was no real urgency, just discomfort dressed up as procedure. 10 minutes passed. No disinfectant, no phone call, no real help. Eventually, Mrs. Calloway reemerged with a bottle of rubbing alcohol and a wet cloth. "Not sure this will help," she said cautiously, "but we'll try to work through it. Just stay calm." Journey nodded, but her stomach twisted. Not from pain, from the cold realization that she was not the emergency. Not to them. Not here. Down the hallway, the murmurs began. Students changed classes, their sneakers squeaking across the polished floor as hushed voices carried pieces of the story from locker to locker. Some had seen the video already. A blurry 30-second clip passed phone to phone with the kind of urgency no adult had shown. Others had only heard fragments. Miss Halden, glue in her hair. She walked out. With each retelling, the narrative shifted. Some whispered that Journey had been disruptive again. Others asked if she had provoked it. The facts were already mutating, repackaged to soften the cruelty, to dilute the offense. By the time the story reached the front office, it no longer resembled what had happened. It became another disruption to manage, not an injustice to address. Principal David Thorne was in his office when the incident was first brought to his attention. Late 40s, sharp dresser, a man who prided himself on maintaining optics, more concerned with public perception than policy enforcement. He was handed a vague report. Student left classroom upset, potential hair incident, teacher involved. He raised an eyebrow. "Hair incident?" he asked, already reaching for the stack of emails on his desk. "Glue," the assistant clarified. "Some sort of glue on the hair. Allegedly." Thorne paused, then sighed. "Who's the teacher?"
"Ms. Halden."
He nodded slowly. Beatrice Halden wasn't just a teacher. She was a staple. Tenure, donors, respected by the PTA. Removing her would cause ripples. The kind of ripples that ended up in local newspapers. He tapped a pen against his desk and made a decision he wouldn't admit aloud. Delay. "Has a parent been called?" "Not yet." "Let's gather more information first," Thorne said, standing to straighten his tie in the mirror on the far wall. "I don't want to stir anything until we have the full picture." Back in the nurse's office, Journey remained seated, eyes fixed on the wall clock. A faint chemical scent floated in the air from the rubbing alcohol Mrs. Calloway had used in vain. The cloth had done nothing but smear the glue, and now the braid was stiffer than before, a symbol of the institutional failure settling around her. No administrator had arrived. No call had been made. Her silence was being met with more silence. Outside the glass window, a student passing by caught a glimpse of her sitting alone. He whispered to a girl beside him. She peeked in, then kept walking, pulling her phone out of her pocket. Journey was no longer just a student. She was a story now, a trending one. Finally, the nurse seemed to feel the pressure of inaction. "Let me just check in with the principal," she said, stepping out into the hallway, leaving Journey alone. The girl stared at her own reflection in the metallic panel of a locked cabinet, eyes rimmed with fatigue, face calm but far too mature for her age. In the office, Mrs. Calloway spoke in hushed tones. "She's still waiting. I think it's serious. The teacher poured glue on her. I don't know why no one's called her family yet." Principal Thorne waved her off. "I'll take care of it," he said, pulling out the student's file, flipping it open with a practiced flick. His eyes scanned the Guardian information, landing on a number highlighted in bold. Journey Carter. Guardian listed as Shaquille O'Neal. He frowned. "Is this a joke?" Mrs. Calloway shook her head. I assumed it was some clerical mix-up. Thorne blinked. You mean the Shaquille O'Neal? I believe so. She lives with her grandparents. Thorne's pulse ticked up a notch. He turned back toward his desk, suddenly far more interested than moments ago. Let me handle the call. He dialed the number, heartbeat growing louder in his ears. The phone rang twice. Then a voice, deep, calm, unmistakable, answered. Hello? Yes. Hello, Thorne began, his voice overly bright. This is Principal David Thorne from Riverside Elementary. I'm calling about an incident with your granddaughter, Journey Carter. She's all right, but there was an unfortunate situation involving her teacher and an art supply. The voice on the other end didn't interrupt, didn't rush. It simply said, send me the address. I'm on my way. Click. No shouting, no demands. Just a statement, delivered with the kind of calm that made people nervous. Thorne sat back in his chair, suddenly very aware of how little he understood about the ground he'd been walking on. Back in the nurse's office, Journey looked up as the door creaked open. The nurse re-entered, this time with the receptionist in tow, both trying to offer warm smiles that arrived a beat too late. We called your guardian, Mrs. Calloway said softly. He's on his way. Journey didn't respond. She just closed her eyes for a moment and exhaled. Somewhere in that breath was relief, but also something heavier, not just hope, but memory of who she was, of who she came from, and what that meant in a world built to forget. Down the hallway, the whispers continued, but something in their tone had changed, less curious now, more cautious, because the story was no longer about what had happened to Journey. It was about who was about to walk through the front doors. Shaka Big Shaq. O'Neal leaned forward, his massive hands delicately adjusting a rook. Across from him, his mother Lucille studied the board with a wry smile, while his daughter Maura sat cross-legged on the floor nearby, earbuds in, nodding along to a playlist only she could hear. It was one of those rare afternoons where peace felt earned. Shaq hadn't checked his phone in an hour, a rarity. No interviews, no calls from agents, just family, strategy, and the rhythm of wooden pieces sliding across marble squares. Lucille moved her queen with surgical precision and gave her son a look. Don't think just 'cause you tall you can see all the moves. Shaq chuckled. Mama, I let you win last time. Don't make me regret it. Miara grinned without looking up. You always talk trash before losing. The mood was warm, easy. Shaq leaned back, cracking his knuckles, preparing his counter, when his phone sitting face down on the windowsill buzzed once, then again, and then it rang. Lucille gave him a glance. You expecting someone? Nope, he said, but the second buzz made him lean over and pick it up. He saw the caller ID Riverside Elementary School. His face changed, not drastically, but enough for Lucille to sit straighter. He answered on speaker. This is Shaquille. The voice on the other end was overly polite, too rehearsed. Mr. O'Neal. This is Principal Thorne from Riverside Elementary. I'm calling about your granddaughter, Journey Carter. There was an incident involving one of her teachers and a classroom material. Shaq didn't blink. What kind of material? Super glue, sir. It was allegedly placed on her hair by Miss Beatrice Halden. We're still investigating the context. He didn't let him finish. Send me the address. Silence. Then Thorne stammered. Yes, of course, I'll have it texted immediately. Shaq ended the call without another word. He stood up slowly. Not abruptly. He moved like someone used to being the calm before a storm. Miara pulled her earbuds out. What happened? Lucille had already stood, her hand lightly gripping the back of the chair. Was it Journey? Shaq nodded once, heading down the hallway toward his closet. It was glue. Her hair. Miara's mouth fell open. Wait, what? Like a prank? No, Lucille said softly. Not a prank. Shaq pulled on a dark button-up and a navy jacket. He moved with intention, but not fury. He had felt this heat before, in locker rooms before a tough game, in boardrooms where they called him a figurehead without realizing who'd signed the check. No one at Riverside Elementary knew that Shaquille O'Neal owned the land their school sat on, that the district's budget had been patched more than once by an anonymous donor, one who'd never wanted his name in press releases. He hadn't wanted headlines. He wanted quiet impact, real change. And he had believed, maybe foolishly, that anonymity would protect the integrity of that mission. But now they'd gone after his granddaughter, As he walked past the framed photo of Journey holding a basketball half her size, he paused. He remembered the first time he saw her dribble. Just 4 years old, tongue sticking out in focus, hair tied in puffballs, eyes glowing. That girl was his whole world, a mirror of his strength and Lucille's fire. Lucille followed him to the foyer. "You want me to ride with you?" Shaq shook his head. "Nah, I need to do this alone." She studied him for a moment. "Don't let the old ghosts do the talking." He met her eyes. "I won't, but I remember 'em just fine." As he stepped into the black SUV, keys already in hand, a memory surfaced of himself at 13, walking into a Louisiana gym with his mother, after being called a name he didn't know but felt in his bones. She'd told him then, "You don't fight with fists, you fight with presence, with legacy." So now he wasn't driving to confront. He was driving to remind. Remind them who his granddaughter was. Remind them what dignity looked like. Remind them that some roots run too deep to be shaken. He merged onto the freeway as the sun began to dip behind the skyline. The wheels turned faster, and so did his mind. He thought about every boardroom where they called him a gentle giant. About the whispers that called black success an exception, not a birthright. About every school suspension that black kids had earned for less than what Ms. Halden had done today. He thought about Journey sitting there, glue hardening in her braids, dignity quietly bleeding out while adults debated protocol. He gripped the steering wheel tighter. Not in anger, in purpose. By the time he reached the school's parking lot, the tension inside him wasn't rage. It was focus, because they had no idea the land they stood on was already his. And now, so was the moment. In the front office of Riverside Elementary, the air had shifted from indifferent routine to quiet chaos. The clock on the wall ticked louder. Staff exchanged glances, but said nothing. The kind of nothing that held too much meaning. A secretary tapped nervously at her keyboard, pretending to focus. The front desk phone rang once, then stopped. No one moved to answer. Principal David Thorne stood by the main window with his arms folded tightly across his chest, watching the parking lot as though it were a countdown. He'd just gotten off the phone with the superintendent. It hadn't gone well. He'd used the same words: unfortunate, contextual, complex, but the superintendent's voice had gone colder with every sentence. "You're telling me you let this happen to the granddaughter of the man who owns a silent equity stake in our district foundation?" Thorne had tried to explain that he didn't know that no one knew, but the damage was done. The moment he mentioned Shaquille O'Neal's name, the call ended with 4 words: "Keep this off headlines." Across the hall, Ms. Beatrice Halden sat in the faculty lounge, her face flushed not with regret, but with fear poorly disguised as indignation. She fumbled with a lukewarm cup of coffee, holding it like a shield. It wasn't malicious, she kept saying to herself. "I was trying to make a point. The girl was being disruptive. I didn't." But her words trailed off when she saw the assistant principal pass by the door without making eye contact. The shift had begun. She could feel it. The walls once so firm around her tenure were beginning to lean. Meanwhile, students whispered in the hallway like wind cutting through stone. The story had evolved. The video had circulated. Now everyone knew who Journey's grandfather was. Some were in disbelief. Others nodded like it explained everything. But no one laughed. Not anymore. Because the narrative wasn't just about a teacher and a student. It was about power, about race, about how far someone could be pushed before they pushed back, and whether, just this once, someone would finally be held accountable. Journey, still sitting quietly in the nurse's office, hadn't asked to go home, hadn't cried, hadn't even asked for the nurse to call back again. She just sat, back straight, eyes steady, braids still stiff with glue. The silence around her wasn't empty. It was dense, full of all the things no one dared say aloud. Outside, a black SUV eased into the visitor's parking space. Engine low, windows tinted. Shaq didn't rush. He stepped out, calm and unreadable, dressed in dark navy slacks and a crisp collared shirt, the weight of his presence stretching out before him like a shadow. He didn't look like a celebrity. He looked like a reckoning. The security officer at the front doors, Mr. Banner, recognized him instantly and stood up straighter. "Mr. O'Neal, I didn't know you'd..." Shaq gave a small nod. "You know where my granddaughter is?"
"Yes, sir. Nurse's office. End of the west hallway."
Shaq didn't move just yet. Instead, he glanced around. The front office fell into an unnatural hush as staff ducked behind monitors and clipboards. They weren't used to accountability arriving in person. He walked in slowly, nodding again at the receptionist, who opened her mouth, then closed it. Principal Thorne met him halfway with a strained smile, hand outstretched. Mr. O'Neill. Shaquille, it's an honor. Let me say, first and foremost, we are deeply. Shaq didn't shake the hand. He didn't scowl either. He simply looked past Thorne, down the hall. Where's Miss Halden? She's in the lounge. We've asked her to remain there and Good. Thorne tried again. This is all a big misunderstanding. We're working internally to evaluate. Shaq turned to him, finally. His voice was low, but firm. You didn't call until you realized who she belonged to. Thorne hesitated, lips parting like a man trying to draft an excuse he hadn't written yet. Shaq stepped closer, his sighs swallowing the space between them. You knew a student had glue poured on her head by a teacher, and you waited. You stalled. You called this a contextual situation. I've read that script before. Thorne exhaled slowly. We were trying to de-escalate. No, Shaq said, calm but ice-edged. You were trying to cover it. Without another word, he walked past Thorne, heading toward the nurse's hallway. Each step echoed louder than the last. As he passed the lockers, students peeked from behind classroom doors, unsure if they were witnessing a moment of justice or just the start of another performance. But Shaq didn't come for performance. He paused outside the nurse's office. Through the small glass window, he saw Journey sitting upright, arms folded across her lap, eyes focused on the tiled floor. When he opened the door, she didn't move. She just looked up, and their eyes met. In that moment, no words passed between them. But a world did. Shaq crossed the room, knelt beside her, and gently touched her hand. She didn't cry. He didn't ask her to. I'm here, he said quietly. She nodded. I know. Mrs. Calloway stood awkwardly in the corner, wringing her hands. Mr. O'Neill, we truly didn't. Shaq raised a hand. Not now. He turned back to Journey. You want to go home? She shook her head. I want to stay. Just not in that room. He nodded again. Okay. Back near the main office, Ms. Halden was pacing. When she saw Shaq emerge, her spine stiffened, her mouth opened as if to defend herself, but the look in his eyes stopped her cold. He didn't raise his voice, didn't make a scene. He didn't have to. His presence alone told the room what it needed to hear. I own this building, he said, his tone even. The land. The funding. And I'm pulling every document tied to this place until this is resolved the right way. Thorne's throat bobbed. We of course will cooperate. We're just asking for discretion. Shaq took a breath, not angry, but filled with something heavier. You had discretion. You used it to stay quiet. I won't. As he turned back to Journey, leading her down the hallway, the silence around them became something else entirely. Not avoidance, not shame, but consequence. Inside, waiting like performers in a poorly scripted play, sat Principal Thorne, Miss Beatrice Halden, and the district's legal counsel, Mark Clyburn, a man whose tie screamed Harvard, but whose eyes darted like he hadn't prepared enough for today. A stack of folders sat in front of him, papers neatly aligned, arguments already outlined. Shaq entered without a word. He didn't rush, didn't slump. He moved like someone who had carried weight far heavier than discomfort. He sat down, his massive frame quieting the room without a sound. No introductions. No opening small talk. Thorne cleared his throat first. Mr. O'Neill, thank you for taking the time to meet with us. We know this has been deeply upsetting for everyone. Shaq didn't respond. Thorne continued, leaning slightly forward like a man who believed proximity equaled sincerity. We want you to know we're treating this incident with utmost seriousness. Ms. Halden has been placed on temporary leave while we complete an internal investigation. It was glue, Shaq said, voice low but clear. Not an allegation. Not a maybe. Glue. Clyburn interjected, his voice polished. Mr. O'Neill, with all due respect, we don't deny that something occurred, but we are still gathering all perspectives. Miss Halden has shared that her intention wasn't harmful. It was, as she put it, a poorly considered disciplinary decision. A white teacher poured adhesive into a black child's braids. Shaq interrupted again, calmly. Disciplinary isn't the word I'd use. Miss Halden, sitting 2 seats to Thorne's left, finally spoke, her voice fragile but defensive. I just want to clarify that I did not target Journey because of her race. I would have taken similar action if any student had. Shaq raised a hand slowly, and the words fell from her mouth before they were finished. He looked at her not with rage, but with something deeper. Something that reached past the moment, into history, into memory. The silence expanded, long enough for everyone in the room to sit with the discomfort they'd tried to sanitize. And then Shaq leaned back, folding his hands in his lap. His voice came softer now, but sharper. Do you know how many times I've been told that something wasn't about race, while watching black kids get treated like problems instead of students? No answer. I've seen the same pattern since I was Journey's age. My mother would show up to meetings like this, apologize to, smiled at, told her son was misunderstood, disruptive, uncooperative, all coded, all theater. We knew the script. And she still had to nod, still had to shake hands, still had to say thank you, and pretend that her tears didn't matter as much as your comfort. Lucille's face flashed in his mind, sitting across from a principal 30 years ago, hands clasped in her lap as she absorbed a lie wrapped in politeness. Shaq had been suspended for attitude after defending himself from a teacher's false accusation. There had been no evidence then either, just implication, just silence where truth should have lived. Shaq's voice dropped further. You've all trained yourselves to spot aggression in black children, but never discomfort in white adults. You're fluent in policy, but not in consequence. Clyburn leaned forward. Mr. O'Neill, we are deeply committed to learning from this. We value your input. We hope this can be resolved in a collaborative way. Shaq looked directly at him. This isn't a collaboration. This is correction. He reached into the side pocket of his jacket and pulled out a neatly folded envelope. He placed it on the table and slid it across slowly. Thorne stared at it like it might catch fire. Clyburn picked it up and opened it with trembling fingers. He read silently for a moment, then paled. This is, he began, then paused. This is a motion to activate Clause 14D of the Charter's emergency governance override. Shaq nodded. Correct. Clyburn blinked. That clause was intended for crises involving institutional failure, administrative negligence, and cultural harm that undermines student safety, Shaq said, finishing the sentence for him. Fits pretty well, doesn't it? Miss Halden shifted in her chair, her lips parting in a soft gasp. You're removing me. Shaq met her eyes. You removed yourself the moment you treated a child like a threat. You're just being informed now. Clyburn fumbled with the papers. But this notice includes the termination of Principal Thorne and a full administrative review board. Shaq nodded again. That's right. Thorne stood now, trying to save face. Shaquille, I understand your anger. But this feels... Shaq stood too. But he didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He simply let the silence stretch again. And then he said, this isn't anger. This is clarity. He turned to the door. You thought you could manage this quietly. That she was just another student. That her hair was just a hairstyle. That your silence would cover you. You made 3 mistakes. He looked back over his shoulder. You underestimated her worth. You forgot her name, and you didn't know who her grandfather was. And then he left, quiet, steady, no victory speech, no loud applause, just footsteps and finality. Back in the room, no one spoke. Clyburn adjusted his tie. Thorne sat back down. Miss Halden stared at her coffee, now cold and bitter, and on the table between them sat the only paper that mattered. The one that said, this time, someone answered the silence. It started with 32 seconds. Grainy, low resolution, taken from the shadow beneath a desk where a child's hand trembled just enough to keep the image unsteady, but not too much to miss the moment. The glue, the pause, the stunned silence. The audio wasn't even clear, but you could see it. Miss Halden. The bottle, in her hand. Journey, frozen mid-breath. A room full of kids who didn't move, didn't speak, didn't know if what they were seeing was a mistake or a message. And then the clip disappeared into a data stream, into the digital underground where middle schoolers passed stories faster than the grown-ups could manage. The fallout. The child who filmed it didn't upload it from a school IP, didn't post it to their own page. Instead, it was sent anonymously to a community account on TikTok known for exposing injustices in schools across the state. That account had 200,000 followers. By noon the next day, the video had 8 million views. The hashtag #GenGlueGate started as a joke, but it didn't stay funny for long. Activists reshaped it within hours, rebranding it as Zen Braided Justice and Say Her Hair, and by the time the sun set, people weren't laughing. They were angry, not just because of what happened, but because it looked so ordinary, so familiar. The media got to it late, still stuck in their usual rhythm of chasing permission. But the internet didn't ask. It saw the video and reacted like a pulse spike. Repost, comment, stitch, rage. Students from other schools flooded comment sections with similar stories about hair being called a distraction, about being pulled out of class for violating appearance codes, about how every little thing about their blackness was always under review. And then someone made the connection. It was a news blogger in Atlanta who first realized the last name, Carter, matched one in property filings tied to the school district's quietest financial angel, an LLC known only to insiders. It took one Reddit thread to connect the dots. The video wasn't just about a black girl being targeted. It was about a black girl whose grandfather was Shaquille O'Neal. And not just Shaquille the celebrity, or Shaquille the sports legend, but Shaquille the owner, the silent benefactor who had funded the entire district's modernization under a trust with no public credit attached. That's when things truly ignited. By the next morning, protesters had gathered outside Riverside Elementary, holding signs that read, "Protect Black children, our hair is not a threat, and silence is violence." Most didn't know Journey personally. They didn't need to. They'd seen their daughters in her eyes, their sons in that classroom, their histories in that bottle of glue. The front gates became a stage. Local reporters arrived, then regional, then national. Microphones appeared. So did camera crews. Parents who had been silent began to speak. Former students of Halden came forward, each with anecdotes, not always blatant, but all rooted in a familiar microaggression dressed as discipline. And still Shaq said nothing. No interviews, no tweets, no press conferences, just silence. It was the kind of silence that demanded listening, not to him, but to everything else. Because this time, it wasn't about him. It wasn't about optics or damage control. It was about the truth and the people willing to hold it in the air for once, without dressing it up. Inside their family home, the blinds were drawn halfway. Journey sat in her room, her freshly cut hair curled close to her scalp, tight coils that hugged her head like armor. The braid was gone. It had to be. Her grandmother had cut it gently, not out of shame, but necessity. "Baby, we're not losing anything. We're making space for new growth." Journey stared out the window as her neighborhood pulsed in rhythm with the rest of the country. People she didn't know were saying her name. Not as gossip, but as a banner. She wasn't sure how to feel. She hadn't asked for a movement. She just wanted a normal day. But normal had never been built for girls like her. Downstairs, Mamera had her phone in one hand, and the remote in the other. She was scrolling through tweets that ranged from support to denial. "There must be more to the story," one read. "Teachers are under so much pressure." Another, "This feels staged. I bet they're playing the race card." Lucille sat nearby, arms crossed, jaw set. Same words, different decade. Shaq stood by the kitchen island, phone face down beside him. His eyes were focused on nothing in particular. He hadn't responded to calls from CNN, MSNBC, even ESPN. They all wanted a quote, a reaction. But he gave them nothing. Because the thing was, he'd already said what mattered, in that meeting room, in that termination notice, in that long walk down the hallway, with Journey by his side. Now it was their turn to respond, to explain, to scramble under a spotlight they weren't prepared for. And the longer he stayed silent, the more the country projected. Some said he was being too soft. Others called him a hero. But Shaq didn't care about any of it. He wasn't here for headlines. He was here for his granddaughter. For the kid who hadn't flinched, who hadn't lashed out, who had walked through fire and come out whole. Upstairs, Journey scrolled through her mentions. Thousands of people, some kind, some cruel. But none of them knew what it had felt like. That glue, that humiliation, that silence. She opened her notes app and started typing, not for the public, not for social media, but for herself. Words began to form like a whisper of truth she'd been too tired to say, until now. "My hair is not a distraction. My presence is not a problem. You didn't see a child. You saw a threat. And I still chose peace." She saved it. Maybe she'd post it later. Maybe she wouldn't. It didn't matter. Outside, the chants grew louder. Reporters asked again, "Where is Shaq? Will he speak? What does the family say?" But inside the Carter home, the only sound was the beating of hearts that refused to break. And that was louder than anything on TV. It was late when Journey Carter picked up her tablet from the nightstand. The house was quiet, lit only by the dim blue hue from her room's salt lamp. Outside, chants still lingered, like echoes in the wind. News anchors still scrambled for new angles. Strangers still debated her name. But in here, none of that noise made it past the doorway. She sat cross-legged on her bed, wrapped in her grandmother's old cardigan, the one that smelled faintly of lavender and coconut oil. Her hair, now short and tightly curled, framed her face with unapologetic softness. She hadn't cried since the incident. Not once. But this wasn't strength in the way people always misunderstood it. It wasn't numbness either. It was clarity, the kind that comes when you've stared down the thing meant to break you and saw it blink first. She opened a blank page in her notes app, not to post, not to perform, but to make sense of something the world kept trying to rename. Not a hair code violation, not a disciplinary mishap, not a teaching error, just truth, uncut and quiet. Her fingers hovered for a moment. Then they began to type. Dear me, if no one ever says it, I will. I'm proud of you. I'm proud that you didn't shrink when they wanted you small. I'm proud that you walked out of that classroom, head high, braids stuck to your skin like a wound, and didn't scream, not because you couldn't, but because your silence was louder than any protest they'd ever heard. I need you to remember that you were never too much. Not too loud, not too proud, not too bold, not too visible. You were exactly what you were meant to be. A storm dressed in sunlight. A girl who dared to exist without apology. They didn't glue your hair because it was messy. They glued it because it was powerful. Because your grandmother spent 3 hours braiding history into every strand. Because your culture dared to take up space in a room designed to erase it. Because your beauty didn't ask for permission. And because some people would rather destroy what they can't control than try to understand it. But you didn't let them win. You didn't let them decide what dignity should look like. And even when the internet turned you into a hashtag, a headline, a movement, your soul stayed still, untouched. I know you wanted to yell, to throw something, to demand an apology that still hasn't come. But baby girl, don't mistake the quiet for weakness. Some of the strongest things in this world have never raised their voice. Like your granddad, like your mama, like the black girls who came before you and wore their pain like armor, their laughter like resistance, their presence like revolution. You didn't write this to go viral. You wrote this to heal. But healing isn't small. It's a protest too. So I'm telling you now, write it all down. Every time they called your hair distracting. Every time they sent you to the office for being defiant when you were just honest. Every time they softened cruelty with policy. Because truth matters. Even when it makes people uncomfortable. Especially then. And when they say it wasn't about race, tell them. Then why did you only see the problem when it came with melanin and memory? When they say she didn't mean it, tell them, intent doesn't unglue hair, doesn't erase trauma, doesn't unteach fear. When they say she's a good teacher, ask them for whom. When they say let's move on, look them in the eye and say, I never stopped moving. And if they try to write your story for you, take the pen back. Every time. Journey finished typing. She sat with it, reread it once. Then twice. Not editing, just feeling the rhythm of her own heartbeat inside the lines. She didn't tell anyone, didn't ask for approval, but something in her fingertips said, share it. And so she did. Quietly. Just a post. No photo. No hashtags. No commentary. By morning it had been shared by celebrities, educators, poets, parents and girls who looked just like her. It had been printed out and taped to lockers, read aloud in classrooms, projected on protest signs in cities she'd never even visited. People called it a manifesto, a poem, a declaration, but to her, it was just a letter to herself. And while the country dissected it, debated it, downloaded it, she simply went downstairs and ate breakfast. Because the truth wasn't in the reaction. The truth had always been in her. And now the world finally had to sit down and listen. The media had moved on. That's how it always went. After the hashtags burned hot, after the headlines turned cold, after the think pieces had dissected every word of Journey's letter, and every second of the viral video, the world turned its eyes to something else. Another controversy, another tragedy, another trending name. But behind the digital noise, something real had begun. Shaquille O'Neal didn't speak to the cameras. He didn't show up on late-night shows or draft public statements. He didn't need to. He understood the difference between reactions and results, and he had no interest in the former. Instead, he got to work, Not as a celebrity, but as a strategist, a man with ownership not only over property, but over purpose. His first move wasn't flashy. He didn't fire people on television. He didn't demand new policies through press conferences. What he did was send a quiet message to the district superintendent, enclosed in a plain manila envelope. Inside, a proposal that had been gathering dust in a drawer for 3 years. Long before Journey's braid became a national symbol, it was a full district equity reconstruction plan, crafted in collaboration with education reformers, racial justice advocates, and retired black principals, who knew how to build something that didn't just look diverse but functioned that way. Within 2 weeks, 4 members of the school board resigned. Not by force, by clarity. The second wave came with hires. Not statements about commitment to diversity, but actual appointments. Dr. Rowan Vick, a former civil rights litigator turned educator, became the district's new chief of equity and inclusion. Tanisha Bowers, a teacher who had once been passed over for promotions in the same district, was made principal of Riverside Elementary, not as a token, but as a leader who'd been ready for a decade. New training wasn't optional. Every educator, administrator, and board member underwent a month-long bias immersion program. Not a slideshow, not a checkbox. It was structured like a boot camp for the soul, where fragility had no place and reflection was required, not requested. Some quit, some changed, some resisted in silence. But the foundation had shifted, and they knew it. The curriculum got overhauled too. Reading lists expanded. History got rewritten to include the voices it had always tried to erase. Hair policies were not just updated, they were abolished. Dress codes were reframed from control to respect. Classrooms were repainted not with slogans, but with murals created by the students themselves, images of resistance, identity and dreams, with names like Zora, Langston, Angela, Barack, Journey. The community felt it. Parents who had once been afraid to speak up now attended open board meetings with power in their posture. Students saw teachers who looked like them, not just in staff photos but in leadership. Kids with braids, curls, and coils weren't just seen, they were centered. And through it all, Shaq never once asked to be thanked. He declined interviews, declined awards. When asked by a journalist outside the district office what his goal had been, he only said, "To make sure the next little girl doesn't have to go through what mine did." While change bloomed in policy and practice, Ms. Beatrice Hulden filed a lawsuit. Discrimination, wrongful termination, defamation. She claimed her professional reputation had been destroyed by a system too eager to appease the court of public opinion. Her lawyers spun narratives, rewrote intentions, painted her as the victim of a culture too quick to punish a momentary lapse in judgment. But the case didn't hold. Not just because of evidence, not just because of the video, but because the country had moved forward, and the courtroom couldn't take it back. Her lawsuit was dismissed in under a week. Her story, once defended by some as complicated, became irrelevant. Her name stopped trending. Her supporters went quiet. Her legacy evaporated into footnotes and fragments, a cautionary tale in a chapter no one wanted to revisit. Meanwhile, at home, Journey began to smile again. Not because people stopped staring. They didn't. Not because kids stopped whispering. Some still did. But because the space around her no longer asked her to carry shame that didn't belong to her. Because when she walked into school now, her principal called her by name. Because her new teacher, Miss Ensley, asked her what kind of books she liked before assigning her any. Because her art was displayed in the hallway, not because of what she'd survived, but because of what she could imagine. Shaq saw it in the way she danced while brushing her teeth. In the way she added extra gel to her curls, not to hide them, but to shape them like armor. In the way she once stood in the middle of a room full of parents and explained how her poetry club would be open to all grades. She had found her rhythm again. And that was all he wanted. One night, as the house settled into a soft hush, Lucille sat on the back porch with her son. The sky above was velvet and wide, stars scattered like punctuation marks on a long sentence, still being written. "You did it quiet," she said. Shaq nodded. "Loud don't always last." "She's different now," Lucille added, looking through the kitchen window at Journey, who was laughing with Miara over some meme. "Stronger, but not hard." "She's got you in her," he replied. "She knows when to stay soft and when to stand up." Lucille sipped her tea. "That's the hardest balance to teach." He looked out at the horizon. "That's why we rebuild, so they don't have to." And in that moment, the rebuild didn't feel like revenge. It felt like redemption earned, intentional, and irreversible. The morning was gentle. Soft sunlight stretched across the polished walkways of what was once Riverside Elementary, now renamed Lucille Carter Academy, and the air carried the kind of breeze that made flags flutter with purpose. The playground had been redone in bright colors, the murals repainted, the walls inside covered with quotes not from textbooks but from children. Words like "we belong," "my story matters," "my hair is my history." At the front of the school stood a modest platform with a microphone and a row of folding chairs. No flashing lights, no press vans. This wasn't for publicity, it was for the children. It was the school's first annual Day of Self, a celebration of identity, culture, and the unshakable dignity of being exactly who you are. Journey Carter, now 13, stood at the center of the stage. Her hair had grown out in a radiant crown of natural coils, shaped with care, moisturized with love, and adorned with gold clips that shimmered under the sun. There was no fear in her stance, no tension in her shoulders. Her voice was not that of a survivor, telling a cautionary tale. It was the voice of a young woman declaring her presence, her power, her pride. "Good morning," she began, looking out at the students, parents, teachers, and community members seated in rows of folding chairs. "My name is Journey Carter. I'm in 8th grade now, and I want to tell you a story, but not the one you've already heard." She paused, letting the silence draw them in. This isn't about glue, or going viral, or what happened in a classroom that made people mad online. This is about something bigger. It's about what came after. From the back of the crowd, Shaquille O'Neal watched, hands in his pockets, leaning against a shaded pillar. He didn't stand out today, not because he wasn't larger than life, but because he didn't need to be seen to be felt. This moment wasn't his. It belonged to her, and to every child sitting cross-legged on the grass, braids swaying, afros rising, waves brushing under durags, curls shining like the sun caught them on purpose. Journey continued. "A year ago, I learned something the hard way, that not everyone sees black hair the same way. To some people it's too much, to others it's unprofessional, unruly, or a distraction. But to me, it's legacy. It's my grandmother's hands, my mama's stories, my roots stretching back through generations, who weren't allowed to wear themselves with pride." She looked directly at the 5th graders in the front row. "When they tried to shame my hair, what they were really trying to do was erase all of that. But here's the truth. You cannot erase what was braided with love." The crowd didn't clap yet. They didn't need to. Her voice held them in place, tethered not by drama but by truth. "A lot changed after that day," she said. "New policies, new teachers, new murals. They changed the name of this school to honor the strongest woman I know, Lucille Carter, my great-grandmother, who raised giants with nothing but faith and fire." Lucille, seated in the second row, wiped her eyes with a tissue she'd brought, but hoped not to need. Her body was smaller now, but her spirit, unmistakably present in every syllable of her great-granddaughter's speech, filled the space. "But what matters most," Journey continued, "isn't just that things changed, it's that we changed them, that we were heard, that our silence was no longer mistaken for consent." She stepped forward slightly. "Some people still ask me if I wish it hadn't happened, if I could go back and erase it." She smiled now. "But I wouldn't. Because from that pain came power. And from that power came purpose. And now, every kid who walks into this school doesn't have to ask if they're allowed to be themselves. They know." A beat of quiet followed. Then came the applause. Not loud, but steady, honest. It started with the students, then parents, then staff, and in the back, Shaq nodded once, pride rising in his chest like an anthem with no lyrics, just heartbeat. After the ceremony, kids spilled across the courtyard, bouncing to music, eating from food trucks lined with soul food and ice cream. Teachers danced alongside them. Parents chatted with staff. No one wore uniforms today. Hair was free, wrapped, twisted, shaped, dyed, and honored. It was more than a celebration. It was a reclamation. Journey walked down the steps of the stage to find Mira waiting, phone in hand. "You killed that." Journey shrugged, but she was smiling. "I just said what needed to be said." Still, Mira grinned. "I'm telling Grandpa you were quoting ancestors and everything." As if on cue, Shaq walked over, towering but soft-eyed. He said nothing at first, just held her in a long, quiet hug that didn't need to explain itself. "You didn't just speak," he finally said. "You reminded." Journey looked up at him. "Of what?" Shaq smiled. "Of who we are. of who we've always been. They stood there for a moment as the school bustled around them. The sound of children laughing, music playing, teachers joining dance circles with second graders. Change, real change, had unfolded not like a storm but like seeds breaking ground, quiet, persistent, unstoppable. And then the narration widened. Not just on the Carter family, not just on Lucille Carter Academy, but on every school where a black child sat wondering if today would be the day their identity was questioned, punished, or politicized. On every parent who'd had to give the talk, not just about safety, but about presentation, about tone, about hair. On every girl who ever stared at herself in a mirror, debating whether to tie her hair down just to make someone else feel comfortable. Because black hair was never just hair. It was protest. It was art. It was prayer. It was survival. It had been policed, commodified, ignored, and fetishized, but never defeated. It was worn into plantations, into courtrooms, into marches, into studios, into stages, and now into classrooms that finally understood what it meant to see, not just look. And somewhere, across the country, a child was watching a clip of Journey's speech, on their phone, twisting the end of a coil between their fingers, thinking maybe, just maybe, it was okay to be exactly as they were. Because this wasn't just a story about punishment. It was a story about power reclaimed, about what happens when silence is broken. Not by shouting, but by truth. And when the world moves on, forgetting the names, the faces, the hashtags, this legacy will remain. In every braid, every curl, every crown, unshaken, unapologetic, unbreakable. If this story made you pause, look closer. If it made you feel, ask why it still happens. And if it made you remember someone you love, help build the world they deserve. Because silence protects systems. But stories? They rebuild them. Start where it hurts. Stay where it matters. Speak where it echoes.